my good friend Shmuley Botea. Shmuley, before you came on, I mentioned the story of you and Reverend Beck in Haiti, and how you met over there and you had this idea to have this session on a timeless subject. And I'd like to invite you, Shmuley, since this was your idea, to start and make some opening remarks.
Wait.
Marianne's in a...
He is a pastor who has an orphanage in Haiti, and I'm just his friend, Marianne.
Exactly. Well, no, I haven't introduced
Okay,
you.
want to make sure. We have to go with it here.
Exactly. I'll introduce you right before you speak. Yeah. Go ahead, Shmuley.
Okay, well, can you just confirm that people can hear me clearly?
They can hear you.
Okay. Okay, hi everybody. I've never participated in an event in this manner, and I begin with an apology for not being able to participate in the flesh. As you may have heard, Friday night on Jewish Sabbath, I started experiencing abdominal pain that is scarcely imaginable, and I thought maybe it was a challenge. But it wasn't, and I had to go to the hospital, and I had emergency gallbladder surgery, and I'm recovering at home. But I did want to participate by phone. We were hoping that I could do this by Skype, but that didn't work out because of how dear the subject is to me. So let me get straight into it, because we didn't want these opening statements to be very long. I've known Pat Robinson for about a decade. I've done the 700 Club on a number of occasions. He's always been very friendly to me. He and I were even planning to write a book on humility together, the religious definition of humility. So when I saw that he had said on the 700 Club that people of Haiti were punished for voodoo and witchcraft, I was torn. On the one hand, I don't like criticizing people who have been kind to me and given me a national audience to promote my books. On the other hand, I knew that the statement could not go unchallenged. So I put out a press release, and I did a number of media appearances where I said, with all due respect to Reverend Robinson, why is it that so many religious people feel the need to betray God as an executioner in chief? Let's look at this whole idea, first and foremost, so we can dismiss it, of punishment, suffering is punishment for sin. Number one, anyone who would say that God punished the Haitian people would have to accept that hundreds of thousands of people who they never met and whose religious status they're not aware of, but especially tens of thousands of children were somehow guilty in God's eyes. That would mean that you have to worship a God who would punish children for something that their great-great-grandparents did in 1804 during the time of Napoleon, which is what this allegation is, that the Haitians used voodoo against the Catholic French. Now, if there was a judge in California who arrested a father for, say, murder and said, you know, we are going to put your little 7-year-old child to death for the crime you committed, that judge would be seen as a monster. And yet, when it comes to God, you're going to worship a God who would do that? There were 1 million children who died in the Holocaust. 1 million Jewish children. And often we're told that the Holocaust happened because Jews wanted to be more German than the Germans. They were intermarried. They had assimilated. Whatever you think about that explanation, what does it have to do with the 1 million children? I would never worship a God who would behave with such cruelty. That wouldn't be God. It would be the devil. That's something satanic. It's not divine, and it's not godly. By the way, as it pertains to the Holocaust, punishment as sin is again an absurd belief, because let us recall the same Jews who are said to have been culpable during the Holocaust, German Jewry, who were assimilated and intermarrying, 80% of them survived the Holocaust. They knew who Hitler was. They got out before the final solution was implemented, especially beginning in January 1942 at the Bondy Conference. It was really the Hasidic Jews with long pants and long beards who lived in Poland who had no clue that Hitler was going to attack Poland on the 1st of September 1939, who ultimately were the ones who were liquidated the side of the road to be collected by the trash collectors. But there's no trash collection. So these bodies are being eaten by scavenger dogs at night. And there were body parts all around us. And 5 minutes later, because the nursing college is attached to the city's main hospital, they took me and Glenn to the morgue. It's one of the only places where at least the bodies were kept refrigerated, so the stench is not as great. And they opened this morgue, and there's this enormous refrigerator filled with bodies, and so many of them were little innocent babies, and they looked like they were asleep. But so many little innocent babies had died. And the head of the morgue comes over. I'm sorry, Eric, the American aid worker, says to me, Glenn, why don't you say a prayer? And I think here was a quintessential moment. Glenn and I are the closest friends, and Glenn is a man of God. He does amazing work. But when I said, when you say a prayer, Glenn gave a very moving, very beautiful Christian prayer about God comforting the victims, and God being there with them through their suffering, and God bringing blessing to Haiti. But as a Jew, it was not a prayer that accorded with my tradition. And here's where I get to the crux of the issue. How does God allow the righteous to suffer, the innocent to suffer? At that moment, I said, I wanted to say a prayer. And my prayer was different. It was a prayer that Abraham gave when God said to him that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, even the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, were going to be destroyed because of their iniquity. And Abraham raised his fist to the heaven. And he said to God, will the judge of the entire earth not practice justice? The prayer that I said outside that morgue was similar to the prayer that was recited by Moses when he came down with the broken tablet from Mount Sinai after God had said to him, I will destroy the entire nation of Israel for their sin of worshiping a God of gold like we do here in America, materialism and greed, worshiping God of gold. And God said to Moses, I'm going to kill them all. And Moses says, if you do, O Lord, you must obliterate my name from your Torah. I want to sever my relationship with your Torah. I don't want your book of laws. I don't want your book of commandments. If this is what it leads to, commandments being used as a justification for human slaughter and extermination, then I want no part of it. The prayer that I said outside of that morgue was, Lord, Creator of the universe, He who fills the infinite expanse of space, how could you allow this? How did you allow so many of your children to die, to perish? They never deserved this. They deserved life. They deserved bouncing grandchildren on their knees. They deserved combing gray hair under the beautiful sunshine of Port-au-Prince. But this they didn't deserve. The Jewish response to suffering and the question of how God allows the innocent to suffer is always that it must remain a question. It must remain a challenge. It's something we dare not answer, because every answer is an attempt at reconciliation. Every answer is an attempt at a justification. I'll never forget when I was around at Oxford University and we brought Elder Wiesel to speak to our students for the first time. And he spoke so movingly about the Holocaust. And the student had tears streaming down his cheeks. This is in the debating chamber of the Oxford Union. And he said to Wiesel, how did God allow this? How did God allow 6 million innocent people to perish? And Wiesel looked at him and said to him, that is an immoral question. And everybody was taken aback. It's the obvious question. How could it be immoral? And Wiesel said to him, typical brilliance, he said to him, if I answer the question for you, will you sleep more comfortably tonight? Will it be like, oh, so that's happily marriage, and they divorced. I don't think that I became a more noble or deeper person as a result of that suffering. On the contrary, I think till today I can be cynical, I can be broken. I'm envious of the people who are given happy childhoods. There is no good thing that can come from suffering that doesn't come through a far less painful pill. And so when we challenge God, which we must, in the face of Haiti, in the face of Chile, in the face of bombs going up to Jerusalem, in the face of IEDs killing our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, when we challenge God and we say, God, how could you allow children to suffer? How could you allow well-meaning American soldiers who are heroes to be blown to smithereens in Kabul and not come home to their children in Kansas? When we challenge God, it's the ultimate affirmation of faith. It's not a denial of faith. We're not saying to God, I don't trust your plan. We're not saying to God, I don't believe you exist. We're saying to God, I do trust your plan, and I do believe you exist, and I believe that you control everything, which is why I cannot accept what you've done, and I will never accept it, because this does not accord with your plan. Because this makes it seem as if you're not in control of it. It leads to deism, that God created the world, and then abandoned it to its own devices, or worse, it leads to atheism, to a culture of meaninglessness, that a universe where there's no justice must mean that there's no judge, that everything is chaos. I believe we have to challenge God. I don't want to answer the question tonight because there is no answer. There is no answer to why the righteous suffer. They're not supposed to suffer. It's why we Jews clamor for Yemot Mashiach, the coming of Mashiach. It's 3 zillion our days, but it happens soon.
Thank you, Shmuley. I'd like to invite Pastor David Beck to say his opening remarks. He's a pastor of spiritual formation at King's Harbor Church in Redondo Beach. He holds an MA in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, completed his doctorate at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And as you also heard, he runs an amazing organization in Port-au-Prince that's been helping an orphanage in Haiti, and he's seen the pain and suffering that Shmuley was talking about firsthand. So, Pastor Beck, we'd be honored to hear your opening remarks.
Following Shmuley, I'm not sure is a really enviable position, but I would like to say first, thank you, Shmuley, for inviting me. I really, meeting Shmuley and Glenn on that day in Port-au-Prince was one of the great surprises and one of the great gifts of being down there. It was a wonderful, probably 2 hours of touring the orphanage building, just talking about what was going on down there. And I felt like I had made a couple of friends in a very short period of time. I don't actually run the orphanage. I just want to make that clear. I'm on the board of directors, but I'm a visitor there. I counted up today, there are 17,502 days of my life that I did not go to Haiti. And then I've spent 50 of the last 300 days in Haiti. So there is something new going on in our lives that involves Haiti. My daughter is here, Lauren, she's 17, she's been there 3 times. And my whole family's been there. In November, all 5 of us went down. I have a wife of 21 years, daughter 17, and sons 13 and 8. And we all had a tremendous visit there. We've been deeply impacted by being in a culture and being in a socioeconomic situation that is so different from what we live in here. It very much feels like getting down to life at its most basic levels, where you're struggling, you're among people who are struggling for food, shelter, water, and just basic medical care. It feels in America like a lot of times we're dealing with accessories, they're dealing with necessities. And that has affected my whole family. The night of the earthquake, we were at our house, we turned on CNN, and our whole family started to break down. And I was particularly touched by, I knew Lauren was going to cry because she's got deep roots there and deep friendships in Haiti now. The person I was most surprised with was our youngest, our 8-year-old, and he was crying. And we asked him, why are you crying? And he said, well, I'm sad for my friends. We didn't know if all of our friends there were even alive at that point. We knew that there was great suffering across the country. And what came out in that subsequent conversations is, at 8 years old, he understands that not only is he sorrowful for his friends and their suffering, but he's sorrowful for a whole country. And I don't know how that happens in an 8-year-old, other than to say that it's the Spirit of God that opens up somebody's eyes. I think that's a miracle. So, being involved in Haiti has been one of the great gifts that we've been given. That's how I feel. When we were down there, when I was down there this last time, and I was specifically sent down there by our board of directors to provide pastoral care to the kids in the orphanage, the staff, the host family, and then whatever else we could do. And one of the questions that came up a lot was, why did this earthquake happen? And Haitians typically had the same answer. God sent us this earthquake because he was angry at us. And that question came up over and over again, so it was a topic. So tonight's conversation is basically an extension of that. And like Shmuley, I did not give them an answer. I said, I don't know why this earthquake happened. I know that the world is broken. It doesn't work the way we want it to. And so earthquakes and tornadoes and mudslides and floods and those kinds of things happen. And it doesn't mean that God is angry with you because there was an earthquake here. What I was trying to get them to focus on was not so much a local interpretation of the earthquake, but really who the God of Scripture is. And so we talked about God's self-introduction to Moses in Exodus 34, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, and so on. And I said, this is what I know about God, that he is compassionate, that he is gracious, that he's slow to anger, that he's abounding in love and faithfulness, that he forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin, but that he does not leave the guilty unpunished. And however God punishes people, I don't think we can say categorically that this earthquake is punishment for sins in Haiti, because there are sins in every country of one kind or another. We can certainly point out plenty of sins in America, but we have not been devastated by an earthquake like that. And we talked about the God that we know from Scripture, and the God who appeared. This is my faith speaking. The God who appeared in the person of Jesus, who demonstrated to us compassion, grace, love, faithfulness, and abounded in them. So I was trying to point people to the God we know and not try to answer questions that we couldn't answer based on the facts that we had in hand. There was an earthquake. A lot of godly people died in the earthquake. So I don't think you can say that God was punishing a certain segment of Haitians that were evil. That doesn't hold water at all. So then you have to say, well then, God, if you believe that God was punishing Haiti, then you have to say that God was just sort of wiped a bunch of people off the face of Port-au-Prince and took some of his people and some people who were not his all at the same time. That introduces new questions. So I think that the right place to start, and maybe the right place to finish, is exactly what Shmuley was saying. That the question probably can't be answered, at least not in any simple way.
Thank you, Pastor Beck. Every generation has its share of great thinkers, great authors. But somehow, in every generation, there are a few people that manage to percolate and make it up to the surface and capture the imagination of millions of people. It's not exactly clear how they do it, but every generation has its share. We have the Dalai Lama, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I've always been amazed at the ability of Marianne Williamson to do that. How did she capture the imagination of so many people? She's a Jewish girl from Texas. Am I allowed to say that? Okay, I'm allowed to say that. She's one of the great, real spiritual leaders of our time, and if you'll allow me, she is spiritual activist, author, lecturer, founder of the Peace Alliance, author of numerous bestsellers, including her very latest, which is called The Age of Miracles, embracing the new midlife. And seriously, I mean, I've heard you speak.
Thank you.
And I've read some of what you've written, and I'm really amazed at how you've done what you've done. So we're very honored to have Marianne Williamson here to share her opening remarks, and I'm hoping that in the next 20 minutes after she speaks, we're going to be able to start challenging each other and introduce some ideas that will challenge all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The issue of human suffering is central to all the great religious teachings of the world. Buddha's father, men would become the Buddha, and his father tried to create a world inside his palace compound, which would keep his son from ever becoming a spiritual leader. He wanted him to be a great military leader and king like he was. But the young man knew that there was something outside beyond the palace walls, and one night he escaped. And it was then that he saw human suffering for the first time. And having seen human suffering, Buddha was completely changed, and thus came about his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, etc. There would be no Buddhist religion without that essential aspect of the story that he saw suffering for the first time. For the Jews, the fact that we were delivered by Moses to the Promised Land, the story has no meaning without the realization that before the deliverance of the Promised Land was the suffering of the Jewish people, the Israelites, when they were slaves in Egypt. And of course, in the Christian religion, you don't skip the crucifixion and go right to the resurrection. It was the suffering on the cross of the crucifixion, which then, of course, precedes the resurrection. So in all the great religious teachings, and I see the great religious teachings as a message from God, they are codes, as it were. And God has various ways of giving his message to people, but there is no deep message from God that I know of or have ever read that does not speak to this essential issue, which is the suffering of human beings. And I think just as when the Jew wears a Star of David over their heart, or a Christian wears a cross over their heart, you'll notice that the visual symbols of both the Star of David and the Christian cross has to do with the intersection point, the intersection between the axis of the divine and the axis of the human. So the issue becomes, how do we live on the earth but represent God's love? That is what Buddha was doing in his response to human suffering. That is what Moses was doing in leading the Jews, the Israelites, out of the suffering of their slavery. That is what Jesus was doing. So the issue of the spiritual path, to me, the issue of the genuine religious path, is the issue of our own response to human suffering. And I believe that our mission here, as children of God, is to be channels for his love and conduits through which he operates. You know, when we talk about something like Haiti, we talk about something like Chile, what is brought to our attention are what is called by sociologists screaming emergencies. But there are silent emergencies every day. It's not like people suffered when the earthquake hit Haiti, but they weren't suffering before. It's not like people are suffering in Chile, but they're not suffering elsewhere. 17,000 children on this earth die of hunger every single day. They die of starvation. 20,000 people die, 17,000 of them are children. 1 every 5 seconds, a child on this planet dies of starvation. So obviously, we are not addressing human suffering the way it could be argued that we ought, particularly given the fact that there's basically no real dearth of food. We could feed these children if our absolute intention was that we do. So I think, you know, there is a biblical line that what man intends for evil, God intends for good. I think it's interesting when Rabbi Shmuley was talking about redemptive power. You know, he feels, as what you said, Rabbi, and I assume that you're listening, that there's no redemptive power in suffering. To me, there's redemptive power in love. That's where redemptive power comes from. And I think it is undeniable that when you look at the earthquake in Haiti, this has opened our hearts. When you look at the earthquake in Chile, this has opened our hearts. Now, this is irrational if you think about it, because why is it that those 17,000 children who die of hunger every day? And this speaks specifically, I must say, to the American temperament. We are a very compassionate, we are a decent, we are generous people. If Americans see that a child has fallen down a well, we will hold our breath until we know that that baby is okay. But our capacity for denial, and this kind of grandiose denial when something's off to the periphery, is pretty horrifying, actually. So, once again, if it's right in front of us, our hearts open. Like, and the world knows this about us. The world sees us this way. The world sees the irony of this. Like, if there's an actual screaming emergency, you can count on it. The Americans are there. But in the issue of these silent emergencies that face the world every day, I think much of the world's population looks at us and doesn't quite understand what we are thinking. And for those of us who place the idea of what does God call on me to do? You know, to me, the conversation is not me looking to God, are you doing it okay? The issue is God looking at me, am I doing it okay? And I believe that the issue of human suffering, you know, we could argue here about what's the karma of the Haitians. I don't know what the karma of the Haitians is, but I know what mine is. So somebody could say, well, it's the karma of the child to be hungry. Oh, well, it's mine to feed them. That's the issue, not what my expectation of God, but God's expectation of me. I believe that the building block of the universe is God's handwriting, the law of cause and effect, which in the East is called the law of karma. And I believe as a Course in Miracles student that the law of cause and effect was set up for our protection. The law of cause and effect basically says that if love is your consciousness, love is what you put out, love is what you will get back. So there are two basic categories of human suffering. One is caused by human beings, and one is this fascinating issue, actually, of weather and other quote-unquote acts of God, where you cannot look specifically to the behavior of a human being as direct cause. When you're looking at something like the Holocaust, clearly the theological issue here is free will. You know, human beings perpetrated the Holocaust. Human beings perpetrated the Inquisition. Human beings do things that it's not, to say that God allowed it means that God has given us free will. And I believe from a spiritual perspective that the whole point of life is the evolution of the human species, the evolution of the universe in a more loving direction. So I believe that God lets us fall. I believe that God lets us make mistakes. Sin is an archery term. It means you missed the mark. I believe that when people act lovelessly, I don't believe that God punishes for our sins. There's a line that you're not punished for your sins, you're punished by your sin. And I believe that God is not that which punishes us for our sins. I believe that God is that which corrects us. In terms of these weather events, there's a large and mysterious and unanswerable question. But it's interesting because in Judaism itself, weather conditions are part of our theological picture. Among the Jews, there is, among the Jews, we have the issue of Moses and the consciousness of Moses being so close to God that the seas literally parted. In the New Testament, there is reference to the fact that how the clouds looked and how the sky looked when Jesus was being crucified, and how the earth itself shook. I mean, there are biblical references to changes. Now, I have read, and of course these are the unknowables, but there is spiritual material which suggests the notion that as our consciousness evolves, that there is a way in which many of the earthly occurrences, not in the sense ever would that be interpreted to mean that the people of Haiti were quote-unquote wicked and therefore God punished them. No. But I do believe that there's something here about the lifting of human consciousness. And just as when you and I are angry, we are more likely to stub our toe. We know that there are ways in which the manifest physical world around us responds in certain ways when there's love and when there's anger. I do not claim to have a belief which way this would be answered, but I do within my heart hold the question, thinking that, wondering in my heart, as we evolve as a human race, as we become more loving, should we, of course, take this path, which clearly is the imperative if the human race, if life on Earth shall even sustain itself, will this have effects? I think that right now, interestingly enough, this does not specifically necessarily relate to an earthquake, although the truth of the matter is we cannot know these things. The weather catastrophes that are placed in front of us as at least possibilities and at worst probabilities given our abuse, systematic abuse of our earth, transgressions against the natural environment. Once again, if such things occur because of climate change, if the horrible things that Al Gore and others, Nobel Prize-winning scientists around the world are telling us are in fact coming, then let us make no mistake about it. That will be because of lack of love. Lack of love for our children and lack of love for our planet that would lead us to human behavior which would absolutely allow such things to occur. So for me, the bottom line is that human suffering is the essential question, that Haiti and Chile bring it to our eyes, and the blessing there is I do believe that there is a way in which when the heart is open, you cannot have a blind eye to human suffering. And I also believe that suffering gives you X-ray vision into other people's suffering. I don't believe it's an accident that the Jews in this country and around the world make the stand that we do for social justice. If you go to any Holocaust museum, you'll notice that we're not just talking about the suffering of the Jews. Any Holocaust museum you go to, you'll see you see something about Darfur, you'll see something about Rwanda. The Jews, you cannot, the Jews, like the Muslims, interestingly enough, but not specifically like the Christians. This is a way in which Islam and Judaism is the same and different from Christianity, is that the history of our people is part of the theological construct. So you cannot have a serious conversation as a Jew that does not include the story of and the meaning of the suffering of the Jews in the Holocaust and throughout history in terms of the pattern of persecution. And I believe that at our best, this has led to an illumined side of the Jewish character, which is we do care when we see injustice, and we do care when we see oppression, and we do care when we see unnecessary suffering, because we know, because it has happened to us. We know not only its deep immorality, but we know that if we do not, as human beings, address the issues of human suffering, then it could happen to the rest of us at any time.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you. I'd like to explore a question. Rabbi Boteach mentioned that if you believe that God could be responsible for the suffering of innocent children, it'd be like believing in Satan. And that seems like a very obvious thought to me, that there's no way that the God we believe in would want to see children suffer. At the same time, I know some really, really good people, some really good-hearted people, who sort of do hold God responsible for these kind of tragedies. In fact, the mere question, where was God in Haiti, the mere idea of challenging him and saying, oh, how could you let this happen, implies a certain amount of responsibility. What I'm curious about is why is it that people constantly ask this question? Why is it that some really good people often hold God responsible for what Marianne said, quote-unquote, acts of God? I have a theory, which is that we give him so much credit for miracles, him or her, credit for miracles. How often have we heard, this poor kid sick in the hospital, and my Kabbalist friends in Jerusalem call me, we light candles, we make extra prayers, and thank God, the kid survived. There's all these miracles. So I think somehow we're saying, well, if God we're giving him credit for all these miracles, then should we be giving him debit? Should we be holding him responsible for when those miracles don't happen? Because the earthquake did not miss Haiti, it hit him. So I think there's something that's not necessarily mean or evil in people who sort of ask these kind of questions. Because if we're thanking him for the miracles that have happened, then what should we do when these miracles don't happen? And if he's completely not responsible for the disaster, then does that mean he's not responsible for the miracle? So I'd like to just throw out this question to Pastor.
Well, I think the question of God's responsibility in connection with suffering comes out of Scripture. Because when you read Scripture, starting with the book of Genesis and on through the prophets, there's definitely that flavor in there. That God, first of all, I want to say, the question of God's connection with human suffering becomes interesting only at the point where we say God is personal. If God is not personal and an earthquake happens in Haiti, I don't think that's a very interesting question of how did God allow this suffering to happen? Because God was not personally interacting with anyone there. So there's a personal interaction between a personal God and human beings created in his image. And Scripture brings up the question repeatedly of what does God do when we respond to him with faith and faithfulness or not? The interaction between a personal God and personal beings created in his image. I think that's what drives the question of when something goes wrong, did God bring about this suffering in order to change the interaction that he has with those people involved?
Okay, Marianne.
This issue of how does God let children suffer is so interesting. If the human race were in therapy, a good therapist would say you are displacing the question of guilt outside yourself. If we are going to talk, for instance, about 17,000 children who die every day of hunger, you take those quote-unquote acts of God where children suffer, where children die, you're talking a fraction of what happens. So here we are, 17,000 children a day dying of hunger. What Republican in this room has made sure that your congresspeople or your senators, and not to mention your president, the first question is, why are these children suffering? What are we doing? How are we feeding them? What Democrat in this room has written our congresspeople, our senators, our president to make it absolutely clear that what we want before all else is to know that these children are not dying of hunger. If we're going to talk about a corruption of moral values, Western civilization, certainly American emphasis on money rather than humanitarians as the bottom line. This is the moral question. How are we letting children suffer? Not how is God letting children suffer. And this is such an obvious displacement that if you were an individual in therapy, this would be obvious. And we hide it and we mask it as these great theological questions, which to me, and it's interesting because whether you're talking about the issue of Satan or ego or shadow, whatever words you want to use, it is, as they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, sly and insidious. And it loves to mask itself, by the way, in the form of religious and theological consideration. And so I believe that the force in our consciousness that makes this a question of, it's almost like whether or not we should approve of God. It almost has a feeling, how could we approve of a God who would allow such things to happen? To me, from a psychological perspective, it's obvious what's happening here. It's an inability or unwillingness to ask ourselves how and why we allow these things to happen.
Okay, David?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just add some thoughts. First of all, it's a fascinating conversation, and I again want to thank our panelists for being, I can't stay here, but being there this evening. Marianne is a dear friend and one of the most profound people in the country. Started by saying that in every religion, suffering leads to some great form of enlightenment. She cited the case of Buddha and Jewish servitude in Egypt, and the crucifixion in particular. See, I actually believe that we have to start thinking through a completely new paradigm. I think this is an old and tired paradigm that says to us that suffering leads to profundity, that suffering leads to enlightenment. On the contrary, this is based on a modality of dualism, of like darkness and good and evil, that things are always in conflict. And you can't have greatness unless you have the opposite of it, suffering. You can't have true wisdom until you have the opposite of it, which is a very thick darkness. If that's the case, then we should not try to end the world's ills, because it means that we're just going to end up a bunch of superficial, shallow people who, once we cure more illnesses, and once we get rid of cancer, and once we make Earth more safe, and once Haiti builds buildings that can withstand an 8.8 magnitude earthquake the way Santiago largely did, certainly compared to Haiti, well, we're all going to be very shallow. Yeah, I really disagree. I think enlightenment comes specifically through joy. I joyous moments I've had in my life watching my children go through rites of passage, like a daughter's bat mitzvah, which we had a week ago in this family, thank God. Or seeing one of my children born, or discovering that my wife can show me great affection that I might not have even deserved. I think that enlightenment comes specifically through moments of great joy and great celebration. Sure, going to Auschwitz can make you feel very Jewish. It can solidify your Jewish identity. You're sharing in the collective suffering of an ancient people who have been forever persecuted. And yet, I think that one of my proudest moments as a Jew was dancing with wild abandon in the streets of Jerusalem on the occasion of Israel's 50th anniversary. I was living in England at the time, and I went for Israel's 50th to Jerusalem. And it was the whole city erupted in song and dance. And that was much more meaningful to me than seeing the crematoria of Auschwitz. So the first thing I want to say is that I don't believe that we can continue with this justification, this annulment of suffering, that suffering leads to revelation. In fact, I would even say to my Christian brothers and sisters that I think Christianity puts too much emphasis on the crucifixion of Christ rather than on the life of Jesus. I've just written a book, and it ended to be published, about the Jewishness of Jesus, about his incredible life-affirming teaching. You know, whether you're a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, Jesus has some of the most beautiful ethical teachings that were ever taught. Beautiful parables, beautiful teachings. Now, for so many Christians, that message is being lost amidst the all-encompassing darkness of Jesus, the Passion of Christ. I mean, even literally in the Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. Here you had one of the great affirmations of modern Christianity as part of tens of millions of people who went to see a movie which they felt in their Christian experience. And the whole movie was a guy being brutalized by the Romans, and that was the whole movie. Where did you learn anything about what Jesus taught, what he stood for? So there are many Christians who I think want to recapture not the suffering Christ, but the living Christ.
Shmuley?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to interject, if you don't mind. Shmuley, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say, as you're speaking, that I actually felt more joy coming out of Mary Ann's message than yours. The message I got from you is that you're not accepting what God did in Haiti. You're challenging him in a way. In a way, I even felt some anger towards God that he can sort of let this happen. So I don't know where, I don't see the joy in that, Shmuley. Whereas when Mary Ann was speaking, I felt more love was the answer in a way, right? It wasn't about suffering, it was more about moving on with love.
Well,
Let me just say, charged. Guilty as charged. I think that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Guilty as charged. My message in the face of human suffering is not one of love. It is one of righteous indignation. It is one of thundering at the heavens. It is one even of deep anger. I believe in a wholesome and authentic relationship with God. And it is not authentic to thank God for human calamity and human catastrophe. That's a fraudulent relationship, and I don't want a fraudulent relationship with God. In fact, that's in the book of Deuteronomy, that the hidden things are for the Lord our God. But the revealed things are for us. My job as a human being is not to serve as God's defense attorney. God's a big boy. God can take very good care of himself. But those poor children in Haiti who didn't have anything to eat before the earthquake and now don't have arms and legs with which to eat after the earthquake, they do need a defense attorney. See love from Moses when he said to God, take my name out of the Bible? Did you see love from Abraham when he said to God, shall the judge of the entire earth not practice justice? Did you see love from Moses when God sent him to Egypt and said, and he said, let my people go? And Pharaoh responded, not only am I not going to let them go, I'm going to I'm going to make their work so much more difficult because they're lazy. I'm not going to give them straw. And notice Moses goes back to God. He doesn't offer a loving message. Moses says to God, Pharaoh human being is to defend humanity at God's expense. Let me just conclude by saying the famous story that Elie Wiesel tells. Elie Wiesel tells a famous story that a year after the Holocaust, 9 rabbis went back to Europe, and they decided the famous trial. They brought God to trial, and they said, and they had a week-long trial, and God was the defendant, and the accusation was that God had abandoned European Jewry to Hitler's hands, and the Jews had died because of God. Wow, quite an allegation. Well, they deliberated, they went through, they brought witnesses. In the final analysis, these 9 rabbis concluded that God was indeed guilty as charged. They pronounced God guilty, and as soon as they pronounced God guilty, what did they do? They went outside, found a 10th Jew to make a minyan, the required form of 10 for prayers, and they said that they got the mincha. They said the afternoon prayer. Now, of course, it's a very powerful story, and the meaning of it is, God commanded them to pray mincha, the afternoon prayer, also commanded them to hold God accountable with the face of human suffering. And I don't think we are supposed to feel a great deal of love for God when people suffer. I think we're supposed to challenge God, and we're supposed to feel righteous indignation.
Thank you, Shmuley. I'd like to ask you.
I just want to say, to clarify here, I did not say, nor do I believe, that suffering is necessary for illumination. That is, I pointed out that in all the great religious tales, the issue of human suffering is central, but not because the suffering is necessary on our part to bring forth illumination. I have not said that at all. In A Course in Miracles, in fact, it says, it is not up to you what you learn. It is merely up to you whether you learn through joy or through pain. And I believe that in most of the suffering that we experience on this earth, it's a learning through pain. It's a kind of spiritual ignorance, but I'm not saying that this is necessary. I mean, you can look at the world in which we live today. The probability vectors are grim. They are absolutely grim. Many of my Christian friends talk about Armageddon. Armageddon is an archetype, even for those of us who are not Christian. The Armageddon of archetype is not something to look away from. The issue here is what happens when ultimately the forces of love meet up with that kind of contest with the forces of not love. Well, right now, we're like on the Titanic. We're headed for that iceberg. That iceberg could be a nuclear catastrophe, it could be a weather catastrophe, it could be a terrorist catastrophe. There are many ways that the iceberg, we could hit the iceberg. And our job is to move out of probability vector into possibility vector. And to me, that is what the miracle is, whether that is the miracle of the candles that stayed lit longer than we expected, or the parting of the Red Sea, or Jesus on the cross. The miracle is when the laws of time and space as we know them are broken through. And to me, Armageddon there, what's fascinating to me is that a metaphysical way of looking at that is that for one person, your divorce was your Armageddon. And for another person, your bankruptcy was your Armageddon. And another person getting sober was your Armageddon. In other words, we go through experiences of life after which we break through, and we are humble before God in ways that we were not before, and our hearts are open in ways that we were not before, and we become wiser. And if we continue to act with ignorance, we bring forth catastrophe. We bring forth our wrong-minded thought and behavior, loveless thought and behavior brings forth suffering for ourselves and brings forth suffering for those around us. Whether it is suffering or wisdom, and that's what's going to happen on this planet. Either we're going to wise up and put love first, rather than money or rather than anything else, and turn this ship around, or we won't. But one way or the other, we will learn. Even if we have a nuclear catastrophe, and at the end of which there will only be a few of us left, those few will look at each other and say, let's do this differently. So I do not in any way believe that the ways of lovelessness, the ways of suffering are necessary for illumination. It is just that, I don't think God is angry, but I don't think he's kidding either. And if we go in a loving way, we will get love back. If we take very seriously his commandments, and we take very seriously the issue of to love each other and to love God. But if we do not, if we choose not to, God will not stand in the way of cause and effect, and we will bring forth suffering. That wasn't because suffering is a beautiful thing, it's an ugly thing. But one way or the other, we will come back to love.
I have a question. just for clarification,
Yes.
if I've been behaving foolishly and I need to pass through my own personal Armageddon, whatever
Yes.
that situation is.
Yes.
You were talking about how the pain of your personal Armageddon deepens your humility and
If you break through and go all the way to the atonement.
if you process it in the right way, you move through it in the right way, your surrender to God becomes deeper. So I'm wondering, it sounds to me then that suffering does play a very important part in your growth. If you classify that as suffering.
You are a choice. You can get there that way. You know, there's an old Joni Mitchell line. You want to come now, you want to come later. We will go back to God. The line in the Course in Miracles is that there is a limit beyond which the Son of God cannot create. You can take the wise way, the loving way, avoid the suffering. That is, just as the rabbi said, the beauty, the joy of the birth of a child, the joy of dancing. I believe that that is the option that God has given us. If we go the other way, there is a limit. There aren't a lot of 60-year-old heroin addicts. If you were an addict, at one point you will get sober or you will die. So where the Christians and the Jews, of course, share the principle, this was established among the Jews long before, the principle of the atonement. The notion that what we do share, the Jews on Yom Kippur, and Christians as well, Catholics with confession as they go along. If you do humbly and sincerely atone for your sin, I do believe we would share this, of course, a merciful God. And as we atone, we are given an opportunity, a kind of cosmic reset button. Are we not?
Well, the point that I was trying to push at just a little bit is that in my personal experience, as I've lived with God, lived consciously with God for many years, is that a lot of the most profound growth in my life has come through a path of difficulty. And I think that I'm just stubborn enough not to get it any other way.
Me too, and I think that's true for most of us. Most of us learn the hard way, but I do think that I believe that Shmuley is correct, that God gives us the opportunity to do it the other way. Most of us, and I'm like you, simply do not. And the Jews know that we have been called a contentious people.
So the further point that I'm making is that suffering, to a certain extent, and here I think we need to clarify that we're talking about two different kinds of suffering. Personal suffering is a tool that can be used in our lives to produce growth. And if my top priority in life is to grow closer to God, to love Him with my whole heart, soul, and strength, and to love my neighbor as myself, if that's my top priority in life, and that's what I aspire to grow into more completely, then if it takes difficulty for me to get to that point, I'm more than willing to put up with it and to grow through it. And so we can say then that suffering does provide some sort of a value, or can be used in a valuable way. Hold on. But I think that also, I want to make that point, I think also we're talking about two different things. When we're talking about my own personal difficulties that I can grow through and deepen my relationship with God and other people, that's one type of suffering. If we're talking about a disaster, such as happened in Haiti, I think that's a completely different category of suffering. And I would call them both suffering, but I think they're two different conversations.
And on the second one, what I find absolutely fascinating is the idea, Shmuley was saying, a state of righteous indignation towards God. Righteous indignation. It implies a certain amount of resentment. How do you jump from righteous indignation to a state of joy, to a state of love? We all want to keep our relationship with God. So how do we keep our relationship with God if we're in a state of constant righteous indignation? Because there's going to be Haiti somewhere. And the truth is, you don't need a Haiti. Because in the Jewish tradition, it says that one life is like a whole world. So that poor girl that got run over by a truck, by a SUV on Sunset Boulevard last week, that's also a Haiti. That's also a disaster, an act from God, if you will. So how do we stay in the state of righteous indignation, knowing, like Marianne said, this world is a much better world if there's a lot of love in this world, right? So I think it's...
Let me just jump in for a second.
Go ahead, Shmuley. Go ahead, Shmuley.
Well, first of all, David, let's acknowledge that the world flesh. In fact, if my kids behave like very disciplined 30-year-olds when they're only 5, I would have to take them to a psychiatrist. There are sometimes conflicting roles in a sense, and both are righteous. So, righteous indignation is the spiritual response to seeing anything that is broken in the fabric of the universe. Of course, we're supposed to feel righteously indignant, and we have to challenge God. You see, when you say to me, David, how can we be more loving to the world if we feel upset, angry, righteous indignation? Well, we're using a very narrow definition of love. You know, sometimes love means that you love someone enough to feel disappointed in how they conduct themselves, comport themselves. I love God so much, and I believe in His providence so much, and I believe in His omniscience, His omnipotence so much, that I'm flabbergasted when I see a hate. How else should I behave? On the contrary, I think that whenever we ask humanity to purge the natural human reaction from seeing so much pain and suffering, in feeling disappointed with God's plan, I think we are beckoning people to have a fraudulent relationship with God. And I think it's why so many people don't have an authentic relationship with God. It's one of the reasons people have to defend God at all costs.
Okay,
it's one of the reasons when they see a Haiti, they have to say it must be because the Haitians are into witchcraft and the Haitians are sinful. What they're really saying is, my relationship with God is so weak. My relationship with God is hanging by such a thin thread that I've got to somehow in my mind justify God at this moment, or the whole relationship will collapse. So I have to indict the Haitians. I have to invent implausible, ridiculous, silly arguments, like the fact that 200 years ago they practiced voodoo, and that's why a kid today, as I saw in Port-au-Prince, that's why a father had to use a rusty machete to sever his son's arm in order to save him when the house collapsed on him. We saw that little child in the hospital. They come up with reasons that are not plausible, they're not just, they're not logical, they're not righteous, because their relationship with God is so weak that they have to find anything to justify it. And let me finally say, this whole effort to give meaning to suffering is problematic when you have to find iniquity on the part of the victim in order to show he's not a victim. He got what he deserved. When you need to do that, what you're really doing is you're saying suffering has to have a reason. And if it does, then isn't that the reason we haven't fought against it sufficiently? Isn't that one of the reasons that maybe we haven't conquered enough hunger, we haven't conquered enough disease, because we somehow still believe that there's something good about this stuff? Why aren't we courageous enough to say there's nothing good about it at all? Now, I'm not so stubborn as to say that nothing good can come of suffering. Of course, there's good things that come of suffering. You know, a woman who's an executive at a company who's been very hard on her subordinates might begin to soften if she discovers she has breast cancer. Okay, I understand that. But it usually comes with such a price, with such a high price, that the lesson is almost not even worth it. Because suffering compromises your humanity. It makes you shrivel, diminishes you as a person. And we see that most people who suffered are broken in heart, they're broken in spirit, and they certainly don't have a lot of love to give.
I disagree.
Okay. Pastor?
I don't know if you do, but I'll disagree first.
Go ahead.
I'll say it again. If the thing that I care about most in life is to love God with all of who I am and to love my neighbor as myself, I am not going to get there unless God uses everything in my life to get me to that point. I don't get up in the morning automatically set that way. God is teaching me. I'm God's student, whereas you would say, as a Christian, I am a disciple of Jesus. I'm a student of this rabbi. And God profoundly uses discomfort. And I would not, in my own life, I would not trade the things that I've learned in the context of suffering. I wouldn't change any of that, because what I've gained so far surpasses what I had to suffer that it's not even a debate for me. So I don't see how you can say that that a person doesn't. Well, I know you said that a person can grow through it, but you still seem to be taking that back. I'm having trouble figuring out exactly what your position is, because you have said there's absolutely no value in suffering at all. Yet there's some value in suffering.
Marianne?
I don't think anybody here surely has idealized or romanticized suffering. I haven't, and I haven't heard the Reverend do it either, as though we need suffering to be illumined. However, I do believe God is present in our suffering because I believe God is present in everything. I do believe suffering leads us to God, in that I think all things lead us to God. So I don't think it's more present there or less present there. I just don't believe we go through anything outside I think He's watching us. And I believe that the love of God is so completely enveloping. I don't think we can go through anything that does not ultimately lead to God's final say.
Yeah, and I agree with that. God uses the happy times and the sad times of our lives. If God is who He is and all of who He is, God touches all aspects of our lives and wants to redeem all aspects of our lives. And I'm thinking of the book of James in the New Testament, and in the first chapter it says, "Consider it pure joy when you encounter trials of many kinds, because trials require perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." And so, in other words, if you aspire to a life of complete commitment to God, some of that attainment is going to come through suffering, through trials.
Do you feel a sense of righteous indignation towards God?
No, and that's an interesting thing I was going to say, and as a Jew, thank you for asking. I do not share, surely I think sometimes both Christians and Jews project our own personal issues onto God. And I think that sometimes we're angry, so we think God's angry, or whatever. And I believe that when you talk with such righteous indignation, for me, I was thinking a lot about my father. My father was a man with great righteous indignation, but it wasn't directed at God. It was directed at a world that was unjust. And I was brought up to believe that that is the Jewish righteous indignation, and that tikkun olam means that we are here to address a world that is broken, and a world that is broken equals human suffering. So to me, the righteous indignation that I was brought up with, thinking that's the Jew, is a righteous indignation in a world in which justice does not prevail. But I was not. No, that's not the Judaism I was raised in, or no.
Shmuley, if you can answer, but keep it under 2 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can only keep it under a Jewish 2 minutes.
As long as it's not a Sephardic.
Well, look, first of all, the most interesting conversations obviously are when people bring their own perspective, and in that sense, this is an absolutely fascinating conversation. As I said before, Marianne is one of the most profound people in this country, and I quote her in my books all the time, because in all the panels we've done together and all the fascinating conversations we've had one-on-one, she's really enriched me. And David, you have also proven that not only are you an incredible activist, what I witnessed in Haiti, and such a pleasure being inspired by your work there, but you're a profoundly deep man, and a man of deep commitment and faith. But my
What about me?
to the two of you, that you don't really believe that suffering is prevented in any way whatsoever, or that it should be utilized to deepen our relationship with God or anything like that. My proof is simple. The thing we all love most in the world, much more than ourselves, is our children. And if we really believe that suffering had any kind of redeeming quality, if we believe that suffering had any good in it, had any spark of light in it,
say something.
I do. I want to say something to that as a mother. First of all, as I said already, I haven't heard David, nor have I in any way idealized or romanticized suffering like it's necessary or anything like that. So that's just not been said here. But I think that David and I have shared the belief that God can use even suffering. And there's something very important there. I think one of the big mistakes American parents make sometimes is we try to save our children from a healthy experience of the pain of consequences for having done the wrong thing. And I think sometimes in our personal lives, the suffering that comes is the suffering of having humiliated yourself. It's the suffering of having behaved in a way that was self-sabotaging. You suffer because you realized you behaved in a way that made others reject you. Now, if I see my child, and I know that she didn't behave in school, she didn't do the right thing, she didn't do her homework, I don't think it's a good parenting to say, okay, I'll talk to the teacher. I don't think that's good parenting. I think good parenting is to, within a healthy context, allow my daughter to grow through those experiences in age-appropriate ways that life teaches one. That if you behave in a way that is less than the best that God has placed within you that you can behave, you will suffer. And if the parent protects you from that, then you're going to become an adult who's in big trouble because mommy and daddy will not be there to protect you from it.
But that's not suffering, Marianne. That's not suffering. That's maturity. That's responsibility. Suffering is where, if we really believe that suffering can teach our children some profound lesson, rather than hiding and masking death from them, we would make sure they were exposed to it. We would sit our 8 and 10-year-olds down in front of a TV and say,
but nobody would, I don't know who you're arguing with on that one, Shirley.
I want you to see every dead body. I want you to experience suffering. And we do the exact opposite. And we're right to do the opposite. We give our children an idealized sense of what the world is. We show them cartoons where nobody dies, where people fall off tall buildings and bounce right up, and they just scratch their head for a moment. We show them a world of joy, because we know that suffering scars them.
You know
what? This is that we have to utilize suffering because it's inevitable that we suffer to serve God. I accept that only because right now it's inevitable. Okay. I don't accept it intrinsically, and we have to work.
I want to say something. First of all, I reiterate to you, Shirley, neither David nor I have talked about suffering as this wonderful thing. So I don't know really what the argument is, but I do want to say one little thing, though, here that I think is important. I think in both Christianity and in Judaism, one of the issues that too often is used to separate people from God is when we create a theological or spiritual conversation like, it's over here, your relationship's over here, your health is over here, what you go through as a human being is over here, so God is some other category. So for someone who is suffering because her husband left her, or his wife left him, and they're divorcing, and they have to face the fact that my spouse left me because I wasn't there enough, I was at work too much, or I didn't give them enough attention. I'm sorry, that is suffering. So I would reject a belief in suffering that removes it from the domain of what we go through in our everyday lives, because humiliation is a form of suffering, and rejection is a form of suffering, and I think it behooves us as spiritual and clergy and spiritual leaders to help people recognize that God is present in these experiences that are what it means to be human, and not just the larger issues that somehow make you feel that that's not what my life is about.
Right, and I think that's part of the statement of God's all-powerfulness.
Exactly.
Because if we say that God cannot do anything in the context of suffering, or that God is completely absent from the context of suffering, we've just eliminated God from a massive portion of human life.
He's either everywhere or
And
he's not.
that's right. And if he is truly powerful, then he's powerful enough to bring redemption out of suffering.
Because he brings redemption from anything.
Exactly.
Even
Even Haiti. God has the opportunity, even
Now you
in...
guys,
Hold on.
Shmuley. Someone who really is sitting here and
Hold on. Shmuley, I just want to say something. First of all, I got to tell you, personally, this has been a fascinating debate, because two distinct sides have made really powerful cases for each one. And it's a good time now for questions from the audience. So please, if anyone has any questions, because we're done with the formal part. Yes.
I know that the topic tonight, originally the topic was, why does God
Well, I don't, and I don't think, I would assume David doesn't either. 1 in 4 children in the United States are food insecure. So in my work, and certainly, I mean, this conversation went that way because we were talking about Haiti, but I don't believe I underemphasize suffering here. And I haven't heard David say anything that would indicate that he does either.
Right. Haiti certainly brought it into our faces in a unique way, but I'm a pastor in the United States, and there's plenty of suffering here. I would not minimize that at all.
Anyone else? Yes.
I'd like to direct this question to Rabbi Ortega. David Suissa talked briefly about not putting the blame or not questioning God on the disasters, and yet when there are miracles, we say thank God. So I'd like to understand how do you put those two things together?
Shmuley, did you hear the question?
I did not, no.
Okay, it was for you. The idea is, how do you reconcile when there's a miracle, we say thank God, but when there's a disaster, we just don't know how to deal with it? How do you reconcile these two things?
Well, I don't think any reconciliation is necessary. On the contrary, both are strong affirmations of faith. In other words, if Israel pulled off a military expedition to Entebbe and miraculously loses only 1 soldier, I have a choice. I can say Israel is a military power with great training, or I can say, you know what, that doesn't explain anything. This is a miracle. By doing the latter, I invite God into Jewish history instead of excluding him. But when I see something like Haiti, I have to affirm God's power in the same way, and that's why challenging him is what affirms that power. I'm saying, A, God, you control the world. B, I know that you are good and just. C, I know this does not accord with everything you've taught me about principles of justice and about choosing life. So D, how could you allow this? So I don't see that there's a need to reconcile them. I think it's part and parcel of the same response. And what it guarantees to me as a believer is that I can have an authentic relationship with God where human emotion, authentic, real human emotion can play a role. Instead of having to suppress my human emotion and say, this is terrible, but God loves you, and God, I feel great, and no doubt this has a good purpose. There's nothing real about that. This brings religion into ridicule.
I hear you.
It's what makes us religious people seem like we are a bunch of detached kooks.
Well, I gotta tell you, Shmuley, if I can just interject, I have a lot more righteous indignation for why we could not help Haiti bring more cement into the country.
That's how I feel
because
as well.
most of those homes were built out of sand,
That's how I
and there
feel
was
as
not
well.
enough cement.
So it all goes back to the fact that our economic situation is the way it is. And also, I don't think when David mentioned about redemption in Haiti, and I agree with him, I wouldn't want you, Shmuley, to suppress your authentic human emotion, but I would submit that perhaps you could increase your powers of observation. If you look at the extraordinary outpouring of love that followed that, I thought this text Haiti, whatever it was, with all the millions and millions of people who sent $10. If you look at the money that was raised and how people showed up, this has brought out, sometimes tragedy does. It shouldn't be just tragedy. But it's a fact. It's not an opinion, it's just a fact. When you see human beings respond to something like this, it's a heart-opening thing. And to me, heart-opener and God are the same thing.
I agree. I mean, being there in the context of pervasive suffering. I mean, everywhere you turn around, there's another building that's down. We're in continual contact with families who have lost loved ones. They're sleeping outside now because they're afraid to go in a house. And when they sleep outside, that means that they get cold at night, especially if it rains. Then they have all kinds of problems. And so the suffering is just always there. It's always in front of you. But the compassion that the Haitian people have one for another is incredible. And to see that operating in the context of what they're going through is amazing. To be able to go down there and be an agent of compassion. And I'm hoping that God's living through me, His Spirit living through me, to minister His compassion to people who are suffering. it's a miracle to take part in, and it's a miracle to behold. And it's definitely true, just to build on what you were just saying, that there is no compassion without suffering. Suffering is the pretext for compassion, because compassion starts with empathy. And in the Greek New Testament, there's a term that means a feeling that comes from your guts. So it's down deep within us, and when we feel that way, that's the beginning of compassion. Compassion then ends with action. So it's the empathy plus the action that comes about in a context of suffering.
There is in metaphysics this concept of the great rays, and that all the peoples of the world and all the religions of the world give their gift, the gift of their ray. In a metaphysical perspective, the gift of Christianity is what Reverend Beck just said, and the gift of the Jews is what David Suissa just said. The gift of Christianity is the idea of the human conduit for God's love and compassion, and the gift of the Jews is what David Suissa said, which the injustice of a world in which some are not able to have to submit to build safer buildings. And to me, those are the statements of the great illuminations that are presented by those two great religions.
And just on that note, thank you, Marianne. On that note, we have with us tonight one of my closest friends in the world. When she was 16 years old, she went to 10 concentration camps in 1 year. I have rarely met anybody who has suffered so much. At the same time, she's the person that actually has the most life and the most love of life. And sometimes I don't even understand where this love comes from. She survived 2 bouts of leukemia in the past 4 years. Her name is Eva Brown, and she's here right now. We're very honored. It's a miracle that she's here. You can enlighten us, because no one that I know is more of an expert on suffering and life. Fortunately, she can talk for 3 hours, so we're going to ask you for a Jewish 2 minutes. For the past decade, she's been speaking at the Museum of Tolerance. She speaks there every week. Come on up, Eva. Say a few words, Eva. Oh, she can walk, she can walk. Yeah.
Good evening. Eva Brown. David is a good friend, and he's always so nice. When I'm in the audience, he always gives me special recognition. So what part of my life are you interested in?
How can you suffer so much and love life so much at the same time?
Because life is so precious, and nobody will fight for you if you don't fight for your own life. And if you determine to live, if you have a will to live, you can overcome everything. I came back from 10 concentration camps. I lost 60 members of my family. My daughter has been sick for many, many years. And I always feel that if you have faith in God, God gives you the strength to overcome anything that comes in your life. And David is a great supporter. He is always with me. And we admire each other because he does so much good. And when I'm down and out, I always call David. And I always feel better. And he gives me strength, and I give him strength. So I'm blessed to have friends like David. I see another great friend, Marcy Mayer, that she worked with me at the Museum of Holocaust. And I learned a lot from her, and she said she learned a lot from me. So I think I'm blessed with nature, that I had a good foundation. My father was an Orthodox rabbi in Hungary, and he taught us a lot. And because God gave me such a vivid memory, I follow his teaching. I wrote a book 2 years ago. The title is if you save one life. Because my father taught us, if you save one life, like you save the whole world. So that's why I know that life is so precious, and you hold on to it. And what you do after the Holocaust, you cannot change what happened, but it makes you a stronger and a better person, because you know what suffering is. I know what hunger is. I know what it is to lose your freedom. And most of the time we just complain, because that's human nature. But you have to look into your life and value what you have, and be grateful that you live in a country that gives you freedom and opportunity, and I appreciate that. I came here in 1948, and I was never discriminated. I can be Jewish, I can be free, I raised my children, gave them a good education, I made thousands and thousands of good friends that they tell me that I changed their life. I touched their life, and they try to be a better person. So when I speak at the Museum of Tolerance, sometimes 50 people, sometimes 100, and I travel all over, and nothing will stop me. No leukemia, I'm in remission, and I'm going to speak until my last breath. Like David says, no matter how much and listening, and I wish you all a good life, and God bless you all.
Do we have time for one more question?
We have time for one more question, and we're going to hear from someone on our committee very briefly.
Okay. One more question, because you were staring at me all night. Go ahead.
You made a comment about the young girl who was hypnotized to run. About
Yes.
not hypnotized,
Yes.
but the car sensor. That God has something to do.
No, I was just saying that when one person dies, it's just as much of a tragedy, you know, because one person is like an entire world. So I think it's hard to put a degree on a tragedy. A tragedy is a tragedy.
Yes.
For the mother of that person. No, I was just keeping it in
God
perspective.
having something to do with it.
One more?
The notion of the Kabbalists that they say that you are in this world is like a second of all the times that you're coming back. So every time that you come here and you go, your body goes, but your spirit is going to come back. So the disaster in Haiti, for example, don't you look at it as something has happened? These people were in this world for a certain reason, so their spirits somewhere they're going to come back, so their life is not finished. I mean, that gives me some kind of a relief when I think about it that way.
I don't think any of us have the answer to that, but I think it is a conscious and legitimate question. And one of the reasons it's a conscious and legitimate question, you know, Einstein said, and certainly the Course in Miracles agrees with this, that time and space are an illusion. You know, even the Messiah, the Jews were talking about the Messiah before Jesus came. The Christians say the Messiah came. The Jews say the Messiah is coming, and Einstein said there is no time. So clearly our construct of what life is, and past and present and future, I believe is limited by a mortal perspective, and that it behooves us in our search for God to open our minds, and if not come up with specific answers, because we can't. To me, it's part of my spiritual path. For me personally, because all you can speak from on that, I certainly entertain that question.
I think we're done. So I want to thank Rabbi Shmuley Botea for